Hello. All right, we're going to go over some powers of urban areas today. Hopefully you have watched the short video on zoning, giving you a basic overview of what zoning is like. I'll show you some real examples in Chicago here. And hopefully by now you know that zoning is essentially a way of putting limitations on what you can do with the land. Generally it comes in three types. There's residential, there's commercial, and there's industrial, although there's potential for it to get really complicated and way more diverse. The example of this is a great example from a website called Second City Zoning. You can see here. If you want, you can fool around on it yourself. It's kind of interesting. It shows you Chicago. Of course, you can see that there's a few different colors here, mainly green. Contrary to the video that you saw, the green is residential. The yellow you see on here is industrial, and the blue is commercial. You might be able to notice some patterns already or be able to guess what the industry, the yellow, is typically located next to. The industry is located next to infrastructure. Makes sense. It sounds like what we've learned about already this year. Industries like to locate near transportation infrastructure, whether it's highways in this case mostly, or rail yards, or perhaps even along rivers. There's still some industrial zones along waterways in this area. So let's zoom in and check out some area for some of its interesting zoning detail. So I've zoomed into some city intersection here. Let's click on one of these lightest colors of green. We'll go near the center of your screen. Just see what this is zoned as. So this is RS3, that's residential, R for residential. And this particular zoning, RS-3, you can see is for detached single-family homes and two flats. In other words, two-story homes, or two apartment homes, rather. If I click on a darker version, we've got RT-4, and now this is for two flats, townhouses, low-density apartment buildings, and single-family homes. So a slightly darker color of green gets us more dense housing. If we look at some of the light blue here, we've got business or commercial, and this allows for shopping centers, large stores, retail storefronts. The darkest blue may be something way more dense, so let's check out this one. Retail storefronts on low-traffic streets, apartments allowed above the ground floor. So it can be very interesting. It looks like it actually wasn't more dense, but kind of fun to look around, at least at a real zoning map. Now, the zoning can also deal with very specific building restrictions, like where a building should be located from the beginning of the property to the curb, or the beginning of the building to the curb, or perhaps height. I'll show you a diagram of how building heights are regulated. And these are also, in general, zoning regulations, that is, less likely to exist in LDCs and even in many parts of Europe. So I'm not trying to say that zoning is good or bad, it just is. There are certainly some people who will have big issues with zoning, whether it's zoning changes in a particular area. I know in Chicago, zoning changes can be a really big deal and sometimes very difficult to get done. Let's say you bought a property and you want to add a second apartment to the property so you can rent it out and make some money. You may not be allowed to do that. And if you want to get a zoning change, it can be expensive, it can be a hassle, and so lots of people don't do it. So zoning can be controversial, and in some ways it can be very bad. We may talk about that more another day. Here's an example of how zoning restrictions help make things a bit better. Chicago went through some of the same problems as New York City. In the early 1900s, 1920s especially, lots of taller buildings were built in cities, skyscrapers, upwards of 50, 60 stories. And there was a concern that if the buildings kept being built like you see on the left, basically taking up as much space as possible for their entire height, the problem that you'd have walking in cities is that there would be very little light getting down to the street level. It would be very depressing, almost kind of scary. So as a result of this, cities across the country, New York, Chicago, and many others, set regulations on building height at certain levels, or building width at certain heights. So you can see instead the building design on the right became a little bit more popular, where, as you probably have seen it a lot today, buildings of certain heights end up having to be a certain width at maximum. And this is generally to allow more light to reach the city streets. So zoning can cover a variety of things, from what type of building you can put somewhere to what that building looks like. There are even regulations probably in your own housing subdivision. If you buy a house in a housing subdivision, Just because you own the property doesn't mean you can do whatever you want to it. You may not be able to paint it pink and add 7 chimneys, or just make all your doors garage doors, or add a moat around it. These would probably violate zoning rules. So unfortunately, just because you own a property doesn't mean you can do whatever you want with it, often because of local zoning regulations. Ignore that chart on the bottom left of the page for now. This is supposed to come up later. So for now, let's just talk about annexation. Annexation is a very simple term. It just means adding territory, usually through legal means, though sometimes it can be through force, but that's not really relevant for what we're talking about today. Cities often add territory, at least they used to, through annexation. Here's a very good example that's kind of local. For those of you that live in the Wilmette area, you may know that there used to be a town called Grosse Pointe. Grosse Pointe Road even still exists. Grosse Pointe was a town until it basically ran out of money in the early 1920s. At that point, it was going to cease to exist. Grosse Pointe, like any other town, is a legal body. It's an entity that exists on paper. So if it was running out of money, it was in need of being bailed out, essentially, or being bought out. This was what happened to Grosse Pointe. It was essentially bought by Wilmette. So Wilmette expanded by annexing Grosse Pointe. There are tons of examples of how this has happened in the Chicago area. Again, ignore that stuff on density gradient for now. This map on the right shows you how Chicago has expanded over the years as a result of annexing territory. You can see in the very center, 1837, Chicago used to be much smaller, bordered by North and Cermak and probably Ashland Avenue on the west side there, until around 1870 when it grew a huge amount, until 1890 when it annexed a whole bunch of other territory, until more recently when about 60 years ago O'Hare Airport was annexed, most recently in 1960. So cities often grow and annex territory. Of course, as more and more territory gets added, there's less and less territory to add. So there's not really much else that Chicago can add unless some other places nearby, for example, go bankrupt or whatever. So there is potential Chicago could get larger in the future. I'll add that the opposite can also happen. Some places can choose to revolt, sometimes peacefully. Some places have wanted to leave Cook County because of the high taxes. Some people call it Crook County. So some suburbs in the north, especially around Libertyville, many times have tried to leave, which is like reverse annexation. Regardless, the other point to add is about what's called the density gradient. Now, I'll add that this doesn't really fit into stuff about annexation. This is just a pattern. Wasn't really sure where else to put it, so it's falling into this annexation slide. The density gradient is very simple. It is how dense land is from the central business district. Basically, you can see the chart shows you population density on the y-axis, distance from the city center on the x-axis. In other words, as you get farther away from the CBD, tracing this blue line, land gets more dense and then less dense. So why is this happening? Why is it not very dense from the beginning all the way to the left there and then continuously less dense as you go out? Well, the hint is kind of in the name here, and we've talked about this. The central business district is often for businesses. So while you may still have some people living in the central business district or near it, many people do not. If you remember the bid rent curve, the most expensive land is pretty much always in the downtown area, the center of a city. So if you're the person who owns that property and you want to make the most money off of that property, you would probably not want to build a residential building. You're going to make more money by having a commercial space, because businesses have one goal: to make money. So they're going to make you more money than a condominium building would, for example. Don't get me wrong, you can make money building apartment buildings or condominium buildings, but business buildings, office buildings are probably going to make you more money. So we end up finding more of that in the central business district, and then once the land gets a little bit cheaper outside the CBD, you end up seeing those tall condominium towers. As you can see here, it's the density peak. You'll have large high-rises for people to live in and hopefully have a short commute to work. And then as you get farther and farther out, you start seeing more 2 flats, 3 flats, in other words, duplexes or triple-decker homes or apartments And then finally, as you get out to the suburbs or the edges of the city, you see more single-family homes. So the residential density gradient is pretty logical flow, I would say. If you need a real-life example of that, though that chart is good enough to draw on your note card, here's a real-life example for Cleveland from 1950 to 1990. Now, if I had you guess how their residential density gradient would change over time, hopefully you would guess that it's become less dense in general. Overall, at least note that the pattern I showed you on the previous slide is what you see here. You can see it's not the most dense in the CBD, and then it gets more dense as you leave the CBD, and then it gets less and less dense as you make it out to more distant parts of the city. Now, as for why this change has happened, going from very dense to less dense outside the CBD, hopefully you could tell me some of the reasons we've learned about already this unit. For example, you know that between 1950 and 1960, tons of people moved from the CBD out to the suburbs. Now, while these numbers are pretty much all the same, you can see it has gotten a bit more dense in the suburbs. I would also add, maybe more importantly, that Cleveland is one of these Rust Belt cities. So lots of people maybe left Cleveland's central downtown area, not to go to the suburbs, but to leave completely because Cleveland stinks. I don't know if you've been there. I lived there for about 3 years when I was a baby, and even as a 1-year-old, I was not dumb enough to stay there. It's a depressing place. So you can see the residential density gradient is not exactly complicated. If anyone's from Cleveland, don't take offense. I have a feeling some of you might be offended by this. Cleveland's a fine place. More importantly, for our AP purposes, you should know very specifically about overlapping layers of government. Even more specifically, you should know that the more layers of government you have, the more complicated things are. Let's start with the generals before we get into the specifics. Everybody in the U.S. has many layers of government above their head. You've obviously got the U.S. federal government based in Washington, D.C., making rules for the land, for the entire country that hang over you. You've then got your state government, so Illinois makes its own laws as well that overlap with some of those federal laws. There will be local rules along with that, and some areas are going to have more laws than others. The more layers you have, the harder it is to get things done. If you want to build a road or a school or a housing complex, you may have to get approval from multiple government bodies, not just a local or a state, possibly even a federal body. Kind of depends on what you want to do. If you want to build some housing with federal funds, you might have to get federal approval for some things. So the more layers of government you've got, the more hurdles you have to jump to get approved for things. Illinois, interestingly, has more of these layers of government or municipalities than any other state in the country. It's a bit absurd. It's not even close, I don't think. I'll show you some of these statistics, but part of the reason why we have so many is because we have a lot of so-called special taxing districts. These are districts created to solve a specific problem. They're interesting, to say the least, and I'll show you some of these, but think to yourself first, well, how many layers of government do you think we have in, let's just say, Cook County? I'll give you a hint, there's at least one. Cook County itself is a municipality, so we've got a governing body called the Cook County Board. You may have heard of a lady named Toni Preckwinkle. She's in the news now and then. She's the Cook County Board president, does a lot of important things. She was the one, for example, who was responsible for passing the soda tax a few years ago in Cook County. So we've got at least one, the Cook County Board. So maybe you're thinking, we've got, 10 governments that exist within Cook County. And keep in mind, Cook County is the second largest county in the country by population, I believe. Might be third largest by now, but I'm pretty sure it's second largest. So maybe you're thinking, maybe we've got 50 governments, something like that. Well, let me show you. Here is how many governing bodies we have in Cook County. As it loads up here, I'll just go up to the very top. We've got this many. Just look at the left side where you got all these numbers. Oh my gosh. Okay, we're up to 100. We are up to 250. We are up to 300. And it looks like we finally hit the limit here. We have approximately 553 different governments in Cook County. Holy moly. Let's look at just the very bottom one. In Thornton in Cook County, there's a road and bridge authority. There's many other road and bridge authorities. This particular one, the person in charge is perhaps this guy, Michael Zimmerman, who's the financial officer. We could zoom in onto some other row here of this spreadsheet and find governments in Lansing or Inverness. Of course, there's tons and tons in Chicago. We could look through this for hours and hours. This is partly what makes living in Cook County so expensive and what makes it so troublesome to get things done. Now, as for these special taxing districts, here's a guide to some of these special taxing districts from a couple years ago. This is from 2003, so it's a bit dated, but I'll show you some of the details on these and you'll get an idea for what they do. So special taxing district has the job to accomplish one special thing. So like mosquito abatement, like here on page 58. You may have seen these trucks in certain areas going around the summertime spraying for mosquitoes. These are paid for by the special taxing districts. So let's say you live in an area with lots of mosquitoes. Maybe the residents don't want to tolerate it, so they want to pay to get a mosquito abatement task force together. So here's their overview at the very top. They are responsible for the extermination of mosquitoes, flies, and other insects within the district. They're governed by 5-member boards and may levy a property tax, but they do not have bonding authority, which you don't need to know about. But they've got a whole bunch of rules here on their powers, their revenue. So according to this at the very bottom, they are authorized to tax people at 25 thousandths of a percent, starting in 1967. And you can see it gets really, really complicated really fast. So if you were interested in getting something done in Illinois, the special taxing districts probably wouldn't interfere with you, but they do create many more layers of government that makes Illinois way more expensive. Here's a more specific statistic on how many governments we have here in Illinois. We have in Cook County, I should say, 536 local governments. That's now maybe outdated. There's one county government, 121 municipal governments, 29 townships, 152 school districts, and 233 special taxing districts. Good God. All of this makes things more expensive. When you grow up, perhaps you'll own some property and you have to pay property taxes. Some of your property taxes go towards these special taxing districts. That top one, the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Chicago, is the one that provides our water and regulates our water supply and deals with wastewater and sewage plants. The Chicago Park District, of course, deals with things from maintaining parks and mowing lawns to planning new parks, fixing things in parks. They own Soldier Field. The Board of Education is obviously a big deal. We've got community colleges in Chicago. The city itself gets money. There's Cook County Forest Preserve. You could go on. But this is obviously just scraping the surface of some of the things that people in Cook County pay for. Finally, unrelated things that the College Board wants you to know, only vaguely related to the stuff we've talked about today of powers of urban areas. College Board wants you to know the census is the best source for numerical, quantitative data about city populations, whereas qualitative data more often comes from other means like interviews, narratives, and field studies. We kind of covered this way back in Unit 2, but it's been a while and it's officially part of this unit. So let me know if you have any questions, if something I've said doesn't make sense. Take the reading quiz again if you didn't do so hot, and hope you are all doing well. Miss your faces. Bye.